As the words of Jesus began to take root in their hearts, Scott and his friends started to wonder what it would look like, and if it was even possible to actually live them.
We began to get challenged, and a lot of our paradigms got rocked, and really what God spoke to me during those times is I realized that I was serving God in the way that best served me, and He was calling me deeper. He was calling me beyond where I was.
I was beginning to get into music and had really started pursuing a record deal. And in the midst of chasing after this record contract, I began soul searching and thinking to myself, do I really want to make, Christian music for the rest of my life? And if I do, then who's really impacted by that?
I was working as a music publisher in the music industry, and at that time I didn't want anything to do with the inner city at all. And I had too many issues from my history, and grew up in a racially violent situation in school and junior high, and it just triggered everything I didn't want anything to do with.
The rest of the crew heard the call as well and began to count the cost.
When the Lord started touching a group of musicians, and they started carrying something rather than just their music, they started carrying a passion and a desire to serve the poor, and to serve the homeless, and to serve the hurting. Instead of just writing songs about the hurting and selling songs and becoming rich off of the misery of others, they actually started carrying a desire to say, wait, we're not going to wait till we become big stars and then do tokenism and sow a little money back into where we came from or something. They decided to do it a little different. We're going to move into the midst of the hurting areas, in the midst of the sorrow and all the disappointment and all the harshness of life, and we're going to start serving those that nobody will serve.
And I remember just kind of wrestling with God, like, is this the way it's always going to be, just for decades? That over here there's violence and people die, and there's kind of like a merry-go-round. Everyone goes to church all around it, but everyone avoids where the real issues are, and where there's fatherlessness and broken homes and drugs and addictions and afflictions. And so I was wrestling with this, and finally the Lord said to me, well, I was kind of complaining to Him about it. He said to me, well, what are you going to do about it? And I was like, what? You talking to me? I was kind of astounded, like, what am I going to do, white boy from Canada, about American inner city?
We kind of know this is really God, because this is a huge commitment. I mean, we live on the other side of town, and this is a scary place. But when you, like I think I mentioned earlier, when you know that Jesus is going there, that's what changes the entire view.
I knew that the God that was in my husband was big, and I had to just trust that He knew something much bigger, and I just surrendered also to His leadership.
As Scott started to step into his leadership calling, the others began to find their own piece of the puzzle as well.
A handful of musicians quit looking for the stage, and they started carrying their hearts into a place and started serving people and valuing and esteeming and blessing and honoring those that would typically have been discarded by the rest of society. What an amazing picture of God's love.
And thus the journey from music to mercy began. A group of discontented musicians and Jesus lovers decided to do more than just say His words. They decided to live them.
The call is to, right where you're at, right where you are. There's needy people around you. There's people that don't have food. It's simple stuff, and they're right around you. And it can be as easy as looking for them.
We have, created our societies in the past 20, 30 years where you don't have to live close to it. So you can just drive by and never really know it exists. But once we're aware of it, we have a responsibility to act on what we see.
There's a scripture in Proverbs 31, and it says to speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. And I remember that scripture, and it was because of that I felt like I needed to speak up and do something.
They'll know that we're Christians by our love. That's what Scripture says. And the idea that we can just go out there and be Jesus to these people in the very simplest of ways, giving them food, giving them clothes, loving their kids, and and trusting that God's going to work out the rest.
They quickly found that they had to trust God not only for provision, but for protection.
I was scared. I wasn't ready to get murdered. I wasn't ready to get killed. And so I really thought he was crazy. I thought Scott was crazy.
But rather than flinch in the face of fear, this small band of disciples dug in their heels and stood on their faith.
I had to come to a place where I had to face my fear and get over it and realize that I had to have courage and step in and do something.
And as the least became the greatest, the king of the poor stepped into the heart of JoJo through the hands and feet of these willing vessels.